With me now to debunk yet another pseudo study on quote unquote gun violence, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, John Lott, who's still rocking that beard. Love it. John, good to see you.
Good to see you.
This is, I haven't, now I haven't had time to look at this study. I'm assuming, because knowing the previous stuff that Bloomberg has put out, the methodology is sloppy. His conclusions, the conclusions of these studies don't make sense. And from just the one thing that I did notice, like I said, I didn't have time to deep dive with it, but they're conflating again. They tried to say that the United States leads the world, which you've covered extensively on crimeresearch.org, that they lead the world in terms of gun homicide, but yet it's, again, a conflation of suicide along with violence and homicide done by those in illegal possession of firearms, typically. And they fail to mention that the suicide rate in some of these other countries to which we're comparing the United States, their suicide rate far outmeasures ours. What have you learned, or what are your thoughts after looking at their study?
Well, I mean, the United States doesn't lead the world in terms of firearm homicides. We don't lead the world in terms of homicides. We're not even close to either of those. We don't lead the world in terms of suicide rates. Look, one thing, if you look at homicide rates for all countries in the world, we're below the average. We're below the median that's there. More than half the countries are above us. But homicides are even misleading, because homicides include justifiable homicides and murders. It's not really clear to me why you want to go and mix those two together. And
yeah, that's huge.
Particularly misleading because the United States has relatively more justifiable homicides than most countries do. And so if you take that out, it causes our rank to fall even lower. Now, usually, as is this study, they talk about firearm homicides. And the thing is, the United States looks relatively worse in terms of firearm homicides rather than looking at total homicides. And the reason isn't because we have more guns or something like that. The reason is because about half the countries in the world don't report firearm homicides. And the countries that don't report firearm homicides overwhelmingly tend to be the countries with the highest homicide rates. And so we move up simply because the countries at the top just don't report firearm homicide data. They only report total homicides. And so it's not a very useful measure to go and look at unless you acknowledge and tell people that you're missing a lot of countries that have high homicide rates and probably also have very high firearm homicide rates.
They're not going to have hardly anybody in legacy media break it down like that. No, they're not going to, because I mean, nuance is important, because there's a huge difference between what they're presenting and what you just said.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one reason why gun control advocates like to look at firearm homicides without pointing out that half the countries aren't reporting that data, and it's systematic which ones aren't. So, right. I mean, but you know, even if you look at gun ownership rates and homicides for all countries, you find that the ones that have the highest gun ownership rates tend to have relatively low homicides. You find the same relationship if you look at developed countries, if you look at all the developed countries. The other thing that they tend to do when they look at developed countries is not to include all developed countries. They cherry pick the developed countries that they look at. And, you know, if you allow people to throw out, you know, the developed countries that they don't like, you can get almost any result that you want to have. And that's even using this small arms survey that they like to use, which is very problematic. I mean, you and I have talked about that before on past programs. And people can find more at our website at crimeresearch.org.
There you go, crimeresearch.org, where John lays out a lot of this information. John Lott, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for your time with us and breaking that down.
Great talking to you.